the content of communications, who you write to, or sorry, what you say when you write, what you talk about on the phone, the messages that you send to Facebook, to Google, and your Gmail box and all those things. Unfortunately, if you're not an American citizen today, if you're a citizen of Germany, of France, or anything else, and the U.S. government wants to look at your Gmail inbox, your Facebook messages, they can do this without going to any court. They don't need to follow a strict legal process where they show warrants, even sort of basic legal process that would work for protecting U.S. citizens' rights. But what this means, unfortunately, is we've moved into a paradigm where there are really three types of collection that have become predominant. And this applies to both governments and private companies in different ways. The first and primary means of communication that all governments of any sort of capability are engaging in today, this continues, but fortunately it is becoming less common because of this wave of encryption, is the interception of plain text communications. You used to go to LinkedIn.com, Facebook.com, Amazon.com, and it would all be http://. I mean, anything that you sent that site could be picked up by your local internet service provider, by people sharing the same wireless network with you at the cafe, and of course, these top-tier intelligence agencies. That's number one. Number two, the metadata problem. Even if you shift over to HTTPS, they still get your signaling information. Now, you may go, this doesn't really matter, but the reality is this is a perfect record of private lives when you go at scale, right? When you want to go, any arbitrary person that I can think of, any phone number that I pick out of the air, any email address that's interesting to me today, I can put in a system and see every website that they've transacted with from their home internet address. I can see every email that their email address has contacted with that's crossed over the internet in an unarmored way. Messages and so on and so forth that are going via common services that have universally unique identifiers, sort of usernames or things like that that are visible in traffic, this still occurs. And what this means is everybody that you care about, all of your activities, all of your political affiliations and interests, these things are trivially known. And now again, things have improved here. Many services have thought about what are we leaking on the wire, even when it's encapsulated through transport layer security. And then the final one, the third one, that's the common approach, is where they actually go to the providers. This is coercion or subversion, or in corporate terms, just simply profiteering. They're trying to monetize their data sets that they have. And this is where all of this information that's been voluntarily provided, that is available to the service companies, can, through the U.S. model, like under the PRISM program, where Google, Facebook, Apple, all of these guys will provide these things about foreign citizens without any real meaningful legal controls. Certainly no court provided judicial warrants. And these are the modern ways of transport surveillance, right? This has changed a lot, but as our previous speaker was mentioning, and as we've seen so clearly in these recent weeks of CIA releases, this increasing progress of encryption, which is a good thing for communications over the internet, is driving these agencies, driving sort of the internet's predatory class. And again, it doesn't matter if you love any one particular government, remember they're all doing this, right? And if you want to protect against any of them, you must protect against all of them. They're starting to go, well, if we can't get it for free and easy in the middle, let's start keeping holes open on the ends. Now, there are some people who say, look, we buy zero-day exploits to protect people. In some cases, that may be true, and that may be a laudable thing. But in general, if we are discovering zero-day exploits and we are not closing them, if we are using them for espionage, if we're using them for intelligence collection, if we're using them for investigative purposes, for long spans of time, right? We're not talking about 90 days here. We're talking about 9 months here. We're talking about 3 years here. They're making the entire infrastructure of the internet vulnerable because these capabilities, as we've seen quite recently, splashed across the front page of every newspaper in the world, based on the reporting of WikiLeaks, these things leak. They leak in the United States, which has the most well-funded intelligence agencies in the world, right? There are certainly intelligence agencies out there that may be more abusive than the United States. Let's not, say the U.S. is the worst in the world. But they are certainly the most capable, most aggressive in terms of funding and research. If they can't prevent things from leaking, and in countries where we have people who may not be motivated as much by ideology and trying to basically protect the health and safety, the good hygiene of internet security writ large, instead are taking these capabilities and then selling them, what happens then? If governments are creating a marketplace where they're buying zero-day exploits, where they're investing in companies that develop exploits, not in an academic basis, not to get them patched, right, but to sell them for offensive purposes, for intelligence collection purposes, what happens when one of these companies comes up with an exploit and one of these governments says, thank you very much for the offer, but we have enough for now. Mm-hmm. The company's not going to go, oh, well, I guess we won't make any money this year. They're going to sell it to the next group. We have seen this happen again and again in public cases in the last few years. Of course, Hacking Team in Italy and groups like this, Finfisher, that are selling these things not just to groups, oppressive regimes and governments in Latin America, in places like Bahrain where they're cracking down on protesters, but Russia's internal security service like the FSB, who's monitoring internal dissidents and journalists and things like that. These groups are going to have parity in capabilities. And these things are increasingly because we funded the market. We as governments, we as publics, we as states have actually been subsidizing what is ultimately a harmful industry. And this is something that is only just now beginning to erupt into public focus. And this is something that I hope increasingly we'll have a little bit more time to talk about today.
Okay.
So in general terms, what we have seen in the basics are moving from this bulk collection, which is still occurring as aggressively as possible, but thanks to the good work of internet engineers, which must continue, and corporate policies that go, look, this is bad for the brand to have everybody spying on our customers. This is moving to targeted attacks. But targeted attacks have been occurring with increasing frequency, sophistication, and very soon we're about to see a level of proliferation that results in a real crisis. I enjoyed it for a thing that a lot of people won't really get, because it's weird to have a movie made about yourself.
Yeah.
And, everybody's like, oh, do you like Joseph Gordon-Levitt, who played me in the movie? He's a wonderful guy. He gave his entire salary to the largest civil liberties organization in the United States, the American Civil Liberties Union, rather than just sort of cashing the check and going home, which I think is a very laudable thing. But it goes beyond the Hollywood part of this. I was most concerned about how would it represent the issues. This film is going to say all these things about me, good and bad. But will people actually have a better understanding of what mass surveillance is? The general principle of how it works, why governments do this, when we see that it's not very effective in stopping terrorist attacks. And this impressed me, and this gave me a lot of respect for the film, because on this core point, for me, the most important point was I think they explained the idea of mass surveillance in a way that I and many people in this room will never truly be able to do. Because someone with a technical background, you may have seen just for what I've said so far, it's difficult to explain this to non-technical people in a way that they really get it. But to be able to see it, to see how it all fits together, these different threads, that is an amazing accomplishment. And that's something that I feel very good that we have as a resource for people who are never going to look at this very deeply. They don't really care about the politics. They don't really care about the technology. But now at least they may understand the broad outlines of why this matters.
Cool, thank you. Again, somehow linked to the movie. You know, recently Kellyanne Conway, the counsel of the US president, said microwaves that turn into cameras. And actually there's a scene in the movie where you put, very clever, because it's an EM shield, the mobile phones into the microwave in this hotel room in Hong Kong. So do we now have cameras in microwave? Is she right, or is it just fake news?
No, I think anybody who's in this room who works in sort of the consumer electronics side of this world goes, hang on. You telling me a microwave company is going to add a camera to the bill of materials for every microwave they produce that customers are never going to use? No, that's crazy, right? That's not how this works. It's very likely that she misunderstood something or was repeating something, or just honestly is ignorant of the issues at hand here, which for anybody following the U.S. news in the last few months would be a completely unsurprising and not very controversial remark to make. But the reality here is they don't need microwaves, right? And this is what people really need to be thinking about. We've had this controversy about Samsung TVs because of this WikiLeaks thing, where for an older set of smart TVs coming from Samsung that had basically a very weak firmware update mechanism, anybody could walk in with a USB stick that had basically a malicious version of software in it, plug it into the TV, and that TV is now going to beacon out and report back and do whatever. This is not a mind-blowing capability. This is something that's been demonstrated at hacker conferences in different ways for different brands for the better part of the last decade. But it's not about who goes in your house with a USB stick. It's about supply chain controls, right? Because the CIA is not breaking into your house to put a USB stick in your TV. What they do is they see when you order this from a U.S. company, when it goes through an Amazon.com or something like that, they see it's traveling overseas, it's using a courier that they have access to. Perhaps it's a partner who cooperates with them in ways that are of very questionable international legality or legal compliance, but within the context of laws in a place like the United Kingdom, which has very loose surveillance restrictions. They have the most extreme surveillance laws right now in the history of the Western world. This was passed just in the last few months. It's called the Investigatory Powers Bill, which wiped away basically even the most lax privacy protections that they had in place before. And they said this is going to make people safer, but in reality, this just makes life easier for secret services. What does it mean? Okay, you order something from a U.S. company, a U.K. company, many other companies in many other nations, right? The French can do the same thing. The Germans can do the same thing. The Russians can do the same thing. The Chinese can do the same thing. When you ship a product, we're living in a world now where you have to wonder, is it the same thing when it arrives at your customer's door as it was when it left your facility? A few years ago, I was warning about this in public talks, saying we need vendors to be better about providing validated firmware and hashing for all the binaries and things like that they put out. Anything that should be on a customer's device should be verifiable to independent researchers, right? This doesn't mean you put a giant instruction manual in your box that tells people how to check that their microwave doesn't have a camera in it. Because that's not very realistic, one, because your microwave doesn't have a camera in it. But two, and more plainly, because this isn't intended for everyone to do. What you need to do is create a threat of compromise, a threat of being caught for a lot of these actors. Because when they start to face consequences for what happened, for example, we have these allegations that Russia interfered in the U.S. elections. We haven't seen any real evidence, unfortunately, out of the FBI from it in the U.S. They say they have it, but they haven't revealed it. We have gotten some out of private vendors, and it's reasonably convincing, right? But it's not really all the way there yet. But the consensus, and I think this is pretty well founded, is that, yeah, this is a plausible case. And so now we can start to have a conversation about, is this appropriate? How do we deal with this? Where is the line between traditional espionage, right, and interfering with elections? And how do we start to police these things? But this is a conversation that we cannot have without facts that everyone agrees on, without evidence that is well established and uncontroversial. And the way that vendors do this to protect their brand is go, look, we follow the best practices to ensure that anything that we ship can be validated by you. Now, it won't be by 90% of your customer base, right? But there's that 10% out there who may be academic researchers. They may be an organization of journalists who have periodic audits where people come in and they check their devices. They check their operating systems, all of these things. And these things do get caught, right? Offense is still much easier than defense. They'll get away with it for a long time. Nobody will notice for a long time. And that is a tragedy that arises from our focus on promoting offensive capabilities above promoting research and investment into defensive capabilities at the state level, right? But these are things that I think can be changed, should be changed, and increasingly we are seeing evidence that if we do not change this, if we do not begin promoting not just as individual companies, not just as individual consumers, but truly on a social level, on the national level and the international level, going, look, we have to change the game. This paradigm of being able to hack anyone, anytime, because it provides some investigative benefits, is ultimately harming the most developed, most connected nations in the most extreme way. We have the most to lose because we are the most dependent on our systems. The advanced economies have the most investment sunk into things like knowledge, like information that's been digitized, like data sets, that is highly portable, that can be copied and stored and exfiltrated over a wire that's only open for a week before somebody notices this. And we are now, for the first time in these years, seeing even the United Nations. This is a report from the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Privacy, the UN's most senior privacy official, their authority. And this is extraordinary language from the UN. You don't typically see things like this. This is from only about a month ago, I believe. They were investigating what was going on with mass surveillance and why we weren't making as much progress as we should be. And they said a number of states, even some leading democracies, which is a surprise, regrettably, are treating the internet today in an opportunistic manner as somewhere where their law enforcement agencies and especially their special intelligence services can operate relatively unfettered, intercepting data and hacking millions of devices, smartphones, tablets, and laptops and servers worldwide. This is why nobody cares if there's a camera in your microwave, because you have a camera in your pocket, right? Increasingly, we have microphones in our TV. We have Alexa. We have Siri. We have Cortana in every Windows machine. This is a disaster if we cannot secure it. And unfortunately, there is no disagreement that we cannot. He goes on to say, it's unfortunate that he has to say this. This is probably the most explosive thing out of the UN here. A tiny minority of states have actively tried to discourage the UN's Special Rapporteur on Privacy from exploring options for solutions in the area of these weaknesses. States don't want to see this problem solved. That's astonishing. And he said further, these seem to be the only people amongst governments, institutions, the public broadly, who don't want to see this changed. Right now, we are living in the golden age of surveillance. This is not a claim from me. This is from the NSA's own classified top secret slides. And they are right. The UN is affirming in this judgment that this is right, and governments recognize this. No matter how many times they say it's getting harder for us to investigate things, we're losing sight of people, it has never been easier than it is today. They have more insight into more lives to a level that is far beyond what is necessary and proportionate to respond to the threat presented by real criminal and military threats to society, right? Whether those be terrorists, whether those be tanks at the border. We need intelligence. We need investigative capabilities, but we need to balance that with the requirement to keep the lights on in our hospitals, to keep the dams closed around our homes, and to keep the traffic lights functioning properly. And this is becoming a less and less reliable proposition with each passing year. I think it's a more complicated question than that. This is always unsatisfying. Whenever you ask an academic, what's the answer to this? They think about it and they go, well, it depends, right? And the reality is, who are we being targeted by? What is the real risk? If your data is so highly sensitive that it should not be exposed to a company or a government, it probably shouldn't be held in a U.S. cloud provider. But that doesn't mean it should be held in a German cloud provider because they're weakening the laws there too, unfortunately. This comes to a more architectural question in many cases than it comes to a political question. Does the cloud provider have access to your data? Is it being encrypted, say, end to end? We're thinking in a Dropbox-like context here, where you have a key and anybody else who needs to access the data has a key. But the server provider, right, the infrastructure provider does not have a key. The data is unintelligible to them. That's a safer model than we have at Google today, where unfortunately anything that's on their server is available to them. They can do absolutely whatever they want with it, which will be only regulated by their terms of service and their interpretation of it, along with the U.S. government's interpretation of it, which unfortunately we know for anyone outside the United States is very unreliable. But these are the kind of things that you really need to be thinking about in that context. And it brings us to the larger question of, well, how do we resolve this? How do we mitigate this? And this is the big question that needs to be resolved moving forward. When we think about the status quo of today, particularly in the context of like elections, right? We have this guy, John Podesta, who's working or has got some connection to Hillary Clinton's campaign. He's campaign manager or advisor or whatever. I have no idea. But he is dealing with a lot of highly sensitive emails. And he didn't even need to be personally hacked where they compromised his device, where they compromised his endpoint. They simply sent him a phishing email that looked legitimate. He entered his password into it, and it's game over, right? These kind of things can be mitigated by things like two-factor authentication. Now, there will be other ways around this. For example, when you start compromising the endpoint, and then you can temporarily use the authenticated, or basically take the token that's being used for that session on the machine to steal everything and exfiltrate it from that point. But when we're speaking broadly, all of these things are creating a stage of complexity and a mounting series of costs to compromise. And this is what we need to do. We need to make the costs of compromising data greater than the value of that data. And this is something that we have a lot of potential for, and particularly in these kind of cloud-like contexts, where if engineers start going, yes, we like to monetize data, yes, we like to see how people are using our services, but we can structure them in ways where adversaries simply cannot compromise our products and services without going to the endpoint, without going to a very expensive iOS exploit. And this is where we want to go, rather than the world where it is today, where somebody will pop an engineer at Yahoo, which was recently discussed, and suddenly they have access to 500 million accounts or whatever it is. These are things that have to change, and they're not going to be changed by law. They're not going to be changed by politics. They're going to be changed by engineering decisions, by people who are going, regardless of what the mores of the day are, this or that, we're going to create better technology than we had yesterday, and we are going to instantly apply it to all of our services, anybody who uses these services, and suddenly you're guaranteeing the rights of your customers not only in a place like Germany, but in the United States, in Russia, in China, and it happened at the flip of a switch. What I'm saying is that this is not an unmitigated good, right? We have had the most progress in legal reforms in the United States on the topic of surveillance since 2013 that we had in the previous 30 years. You have to go back to the 1970s to see the surveillance agencies, the sort of state security bureaus in the United States, being limited or investigated or even questioned in any substantial way. We have had powers fully taken away from the NSA and instead invested in companies and go, look, if the NSA wants to get this, they have to go through legal process. They have to deal with lawyers. They have to deal with courts. And this is a positive trend. But as you say, and as I've demonstrated, it's not enough. We have other countries, places like Germany, where they pass laws that are supposed to be, in theory, reforming bad practices, but they're actually institutionalizing the abusive programs that were revealed. We see politicians talking about how important cybersecurity is. At the same time, we see them providing millions and millions of dollars for them to attack the secure communications tools that are actually making society safer, like WhatsApp, which the German intelligence agency got a larger budget to do. This isn't specifically about Germany, although they have been bad in this regard, unfortunately, because they should be among the best. It's happened in Russia with the Yorovaya packet, which Russians call the Big Brother law, which was just passed in the last year. And if Russians are calling a surveillance law the Big Brother law, you know it's bad.
Well, that's my question, though. I mean, we know these things, and these things are progressing. And my question to you is, are you able to make a difference in any of this right now? To compare that to how things were 2 or 3 years ago, is your efficacy dwindling as time passes?
No, because this was never about me, right? I'm not the leader. I'm not the guy in charge. I didn't come forward to make decisions. The only motivation that I had was to return information that was of vital public importance to public hands, right? I didn't want to tell you, do this, do that, fix this, that's the way it's going to be. My goal is for you to be able to decide for yourself the way the world should be. And this is moving forward. Now, what we're seeing is a distinct divergence between sort of the political class, which is more concerned about being criticized the next time a crime occurs or there's a terrorist attack, which is inevitable, right? Unfortunately, we hate to say this, but there's no way to wipe away theft. There's no way to wipe away arson. There's no way to wipe away murder on a permanent basis because people make bad decisions. People are emotional. Some people are ill. And they will commit crimes, right? Terrorism, as much as people would like to pretend otherwise, is a crime, right? Until we abolish criminality, we will not abolish terrorism. Now, what we can do is target them, mitigate them, minimize the impacts of them, and we do a good job of that. Terrorism claims far fewer lives in Western Europe today than it did in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s.
Yeah, that's true.
Right. We are actually safer than we were, but this it's critical because I have to get to this point.
Yeah.
Which is when you talk about me, my effectiveness. I'm the president of the Freedom of the Press Foundation. My focus is on securing the work of journalists, and we're doing incredible work there. This is going to be a very exciting year for us. I don't like to do any kind of promo or teasers or things like that. So I'm not going to talk about specific projects because, again, I'm not here to do that. But when I talk about things broader for the internet, right, I'm not here to fix this. I don't want to tell you how to live your lives. I'm not going to be the king or the authority. I don't pretend to be. I don't want to be. And honestly, guys, let's be real. I'm not qualified to be. But the global technological community is qualified to have those conversations, to make those decisions, and they are. This is where my hope derives from. This is why I speak in such an upbeat and hopeful manner, despite the politics.
Yeah.
What we are beginning to do is we're beginning to make things that traditionally were considered to be political questions. How do we enforce human rights? Mm-hmm. We're finding new mechanisms of enforcing human rights. So we're enforcing human rights through new means of science and technology. We are using new programs, new capabilities, a smartphone app like Signal by Whisper Systems, which provides a cryptographic library that is then implemented by WhatsApp, which is used by, I don't know how many hundreds of millions or billions of people it's used by, but an enormous user base instantly has access to secure communications, right? And this is what we're beginning to see. What the next step must be is moving this to the protocol level. Now, why do I say this? This is, again, a complicated topic, but I think most people in the audience will be able to follow it. When we talk about encryption across the internet, most people are thinking about HTTPS, that little lock icon. And they think, well, good, this means my credit card number's not stolen. This means my message to that provider is being spied on by the guy sitting next to me in the coffee shop, or the man in the middle at the intelligence agencies, so long as it's got HSTS or certificate pinning or whatever. But the idea here is that they go, okay, well, I'm not being spied on. But it's actually much, much, much more important than that. The real danger of having an unencrypted website today is not just about surveillance. It's about being able to manipulate traffic. The most important story from the NSA mass surveillance revelations that went on from 2013 and honestly still seem to continue through new reporting from new sources in new ways today is a project called Quantum Hand. All the people in the audience, I don't really believe in show of hands things as a privacy advocate, but think to yourself right now, have you ever heard of Quantum Hand? What is the Quantum Project? Why does it matter? And why have you heard about PRISM, but you haven't heard about Quantum? So Quantum was this NSA program, which was how they get malware to the endpoints, which back then was a valuable capability, but not that important, right? Not that critical, because they were spying on everybody just as things transited the internet. Now that internet communications are increasingly becoming secure, people are using smartphones that are locked down, they're going, well, how do we get to the endpoints, as our previous speaker was discussing? How do we hack your phone? Well, typically we do that through the web browser. But how do you get malicious software onto a legitimate page? The NSA's Quantum Suite is how they do this. This is how they attack as they cross the wire. The Intercept, which is a news outlet that had the primary archive material on this, created an animation from the NSA's own top secret slides. This is a top secret slide where the guy in the bottom right, he's you, is connecting to Facebook. This was back before Facebook went to HTTPS. Your computer sends the signal, fetching the page. Facebook responds. You then get a series of keep alive messages, right, to see if somebody sent you a message, sent you a post. Anybody who's on that backbone can see these things, intercept them, use a malicious router to redirect these communications if they're HTTP only, if they're unencrypted, if they're unarmored, move them over to their attack systems, implant them, manipulate them, and then send that new malicious version of the site back to you. You will then have their exploit execute on your machine. You went to a Facebook.com or a LinkedIn.com. What you got was malware. This is not a capability that's exclusive to the NSA. And this is why any HTTP website today is a hygiene hazard for the internet. If you have ads served from an HTTP website, it is a malware vector today, not just from the ad service themselves, but for anybody who is on that line, anybody who's at your cafe, anybody who's a state-sponsored actor, anyone like that. And until we move the standard protocols of the internet to all encrypted by default websites, all encrypted by default communications, we will always have this risk of tampering. Again, if you want to get the actual technical details for that story, you can look them up. The program is called Quantum Hand and the Quantum Suite. But this is something that many people didn't hear about. It never made the same splash it did. But in fact, this is a much more universal threat than being able to go to Facebook or to Google. And I should be clear today, by the way, Facebook uses TLS by default. They're no longer vulnerable to that particular attack. But any website that you visit today that is not HTTPS, we have no defense. We have no typical program that's running in all of our systems that goes, is this the page that I was supposed to be receiving? Is this protected? The only way that you can guarantee that the things that appear on your smartphone, the things that appear on your computer, all of the products and services that surround you every day are actually what they're supposed to be, that they are reliable, that they are safe, is if they are encrypted. Any unencrypted communications today is kind of like a food product that hasn't gone through any kind of regulatory regime or quality control inspection. Yeah, it's probably safe, right? We're presuming people aren't going to be poisoning meat or selling the worst things in the world, and you'll normally be all right. But there are bad actors there, and these things will get worse and worse. And if people notice, no, they're actually slightly different. There's a little bit of nuance here. The parliamentary and governmental, court ruling on this is actually about testimony in front of the NSA Investigatory Committee in Parliament. The minority parties wanted to bring me in to actually testify about what's real, what's not real. These sort of German officials that are pointing to these claims of U.S. officials, are these things reliable? Sort of where is the truth here? And unfortunately, the majority blocked this. They didn't want to hear sort of the opinion of someone who was not bound by these obligations not to say certain things. And I think that's quite unfortunate.
Do you think they were afraid, though, Edward, that if you came to Germany to testify, that once you were here, then you would claim asylum and that you would stay here, which would create a diplomatic situation?
Well, the real question is, what would the diplomatic situation be? That is a popular talking point. There are a number of politicians who claimed that. But what would really the harm be at this point? There's this allegation that, look, if Germany gave me asylum, if, Belgium gave me asylum, whatever, any arbitrary European country recognize that I have political charges against me. And this is not controversial, by the way. I was charged under the Espionage Act, despite the fact that no one alleges I was actually working for a foreign government. And espionage is called the archetypical political crime, right? A political crime is where the victim is not an individual, right? It's not a person. It's a state, right? It's a political entity. And so anyway, in this case, right, even if they said that's not the case, if they said that's the case, he can stay here, he'll be protected, he's a whistleblower, which, by the way, the Parliament of Europe passed a resolution saying that, yes, whistleblowers should be protected. Member states in the EU should not extradite me or anyone else in a similar situation. So why are they saying this? The argument is, if I am protected in one of these countries, the U.S. intelligence community is going to stop sharing life-saving information about imminent terrorist threats. What are they actually saying when they say this, though? Right? What does that actually mean? The United States is going to stop sharing intelligence information that would save German lives. That is the equivalent of saying the United States and its intelligence community are going to let Germans die because they don't like me as a person. Ladies and gentlemen, there are a lot of criticisms that can be leveled at me. We can have disagreements about policies. We can say surveillance of people indiscriminately in a dragnet way is a violation of human rights, or it's just the way of the world today. But look, I worked at the CIA. I worked at the NSA. And while I have disagreements with their policies, I believe it is a fantasy to think that any one of those people would intentionally let, particularly the lives of our close partners, our allies, be lost simply to get back at me. It is a ridiculous claim, a ridiculous allegation, and it leads to the inevitable conclusion that the only justification for why they would try to prevent this kind of testimony is either to try to avoid embarrassment, to try to avoid responsibility if they're culpable or involved in some way for these programs, or they're simply trying to move on, to avoid the topic, because sometimes the truth is uncomfortable.
When President Obama granted a pardon to Chelsea Manning, there was also a lot of talk about you possibly getting a pardon. That did not happen. How did you feel when you saw that? And what about the talk now of U.S. President Trump and Russian President Putin using you as part of a bigger deal, with you being delivered to the U.S. in exchange for something else? What are your thoughts about that?
Well, look, again, this gets back to, a lot of people feel this compulsion to elevate me, to make me the face of this, that, or the other.
Well, I mean, but I would say, let me tell you this, though, Edward. This place is full of people right now. I mean, for many, many people, you are the face, you are the icon of a movement. And, I mean, the questions I've received are all about you. People want to know what's going to happen to you. I mean, I appreciate you trying to diminish your role, but people want to know, are you a pawn right now for the Russian president when he talks to U.S. President Trump?
So in a legal sense, no, there's no legal grounds for me to be extradited. I'm recognized by practically every country that has a basis for this besides the United States as a whistleblower. There's literally no controversy about the lawfulness of my asylum. And I mean that in a broad sense, not my technical status, which is permanent residency, not asylum. But sort of the question is getting into the weeds here. What I'm saying is I'm not this powerful, influential figure who can call shots, who can change things. Any government, anywhere, can cause me harm, just as they can with any citizen. Russia, right, is a country that's got a lot of influence. They're on the stage, right? They're a large nuclear state. If they want to screw me over, of course they can. But that would only prove my point, right? Because I've never been protesting specifically the United States government. I have criticized Russia's human rights policies, their surveillance policies routinely. Maybe it's not winning me friends. Maybe it's putting me in a situation where they want to get rid of me, right? I don't know. But that does not matter to me. And I hope, regardless of what happens to me, you realize the reason why I took these chances, the reason why I came forward was not to be safe, right? Was not to be secure, was not so people, could worry, why I could worry about what my tomorrow is going to look like. If I had wanted to do that, I would have kept working in Hawaii for the NSA, spying on you and everyone else and getting a lot of money for relatively little work. But there are more important things in life. If you believe in something, you have to stand for something, because belief is not enough. Belief is not going to, spring out of your head and protect someone's rights. Belief is not going to bring us a better world. And yes, while it might expose me to some risk, I'm proud of the choices that I've made, and I do not worry about this. I will deal with these kind of things when they come up. And ultimately, I will suffer whatever the consequences are of my choices with pride, because that's what doing the right thing gives you. If nothing else, if you lose absolutely everything else, you know that you were sincere in your beliefs. You know that your commitments are genuine, and you can go to sleep at night recognizing that if this is my last night, it was enough.
Yesterday, You mentioned the Espionage Act, and that's being used for these charges that would be filed against you. I'd like to get your thoughts about what we saw yesterday. The head of the FBI yesterday confirmed that there is an ongoing investigation into possible espionage between the White House and Russia. And what should happen there? If you're going to face espionage charges, we have a sitting president who is, according to the head of the FBI, being investigated for possibly colluding with Moscow to make sure he becomes president.
Yeah, you know, this is a much more complex topic because the question, the FBI director didn't use the word Espionage Act. I don't believe he used the word espionage specifically. He was talking about coordination between the campaign and whatever. The bottom line is we don't know. We do know there is an investigation, right? And this is something that should be a concern to every American and hopefully everyone around the world because you want to know what's actually going on. But look, I have been on the other side of these allegations. If you check the Twitter feed today of Glenn Greenwald, the Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist who broke the NSA stories, it's twitter.com/ggreenwald. He published a very long story about how a false claim about me, right, all these people who said, oh, he's a Russian spy, he's a Chinese spy, he's whatever, was false. But it circulated for years, not just amongst the fringe, but in mainstream media outlets. And these kind of things do happen. Now, this is not to say the allegations against Donald Trump are false. If the FBI is testifying about them in Congress, this is certainly something that we need to take seriously, right? But I am hesitant now, in hindsight, to look at allegations against people which have not been substantiated with evidence.
So would you want that classified information to be declassified? I mean, that's what you're talking about. The FBI says that they have evidence that is classified. Are you saying that all of that information needs to be made public?
Absolutely. Absolutely. If you have information that reveals any kind of official deception, and you believe you can get this to the public in a way that makes a difference, for me, this is sort of the gold standard for whistleblowing. What is whistleblowing? What is the difference between simply leaking something and actually blowing the whistle on an abuse? One is that there is some wrongdoing. Official deception is sort of the traditional example of this. Can you get it publicly known? And hopefully not on some sort of blog site in the corner of the internet that nobody notices, because it has to have a material impact. You have to actually change things. There is a long history before I came forward of NSA whistleblowers who did exactly the right thing. They went through formal channels. They went to the Inspector General, the Department of Defense at the NSA. They went to Congress. And they said, look, the U.S. government is violating the law, it's breaking the Constitution, it's surveilling everyone in the United States. And the government nodded, said, yes, this is very nice, we'll do an investigation. Kind of very similar to what we're hearing today. But no one believed them because they couldn't prove it, right? The government said this wasn't happening. They sort of politically sanitized these things because they approved of these policies and defended them. But what if the public had known? The programs that I was revealing had functioned for more than a decade in some cases. Had these early whistleblowers had the documentation, had they had the success in getting the journalists to take this seriously, to report this in the most serious way, no one would have ever known my name. And I would be glad for it, right? And this is kind of what I'm pointing to here. Is there's this controversy that hits both sides of my issues. It puts me in a difficult position. On the one hand, a phone call about the former U.S. National Security Advisor to Donald Trump, Michael Flynn, was leaked. He was talking to a Russian ambassador or something like that. So the New York Times, the Washington Post found out that he did in fact have these conversations, despite publicly denying this, despite having the Vice President of the United States deny this. This is a deception not just of officialdom, right? More importantly, this is a deception of the public. We needed to know that. If our government is to be accountable to us, we have to know that they're being forthright and truthful with us. On the other side of this, there are serious questions about why are everyone's communications being collected in such a way that these things can be leaked to the New York Times, to the Washington Post. Today, the public benefited in a very clear way, right? I think this was a vital, necessary disclosure. But what happens if tomorrow, a week from now, a month from now, 6 months from now, Donald Trump starts using these same capabilities to discredit his enemies?
Well, that's the allegation, though, isn't it, Edward? That something has been used to help him become president. Some type of.
I was talking about a leak from the National Security Agency.
Yeah, but I mean, people say the WikiLeaks are behind what helped Donald Trump become president.
I mean, I'm not a political pundit. Every political take that I made in the last election turned out to be like disastrously wrong. So I wouldn't hold myself forward as an authority on that. I thought Hillary Clinton was going to win. I was shocked that she did not. Because
I think a lot of people were shocked.
Yeah, 93, 97% chance of victory, something like that on the New York Times. But yeah, the idea that emails, shifted the election and things like that may be true. Bottom line is I don't know. If it's true, the Russian government hacked these emails, gave them to WikiLeaks, WikiLeaks published them and whatnot, and shifted the election. Yeah, these are material things, and they should make us take these issues that much more seriously. This is why defense matters, right? This is why we need to be able to stop hacks. But unfortunately, everybody tries to transform this into a political football about, Democrats and Republicans, red team, blue team. And for my perspective, right, I try to move this to a nonpartisan level and go, look, how do we make the future safer for everyone? And I think that's a less satisfying conversation, maybe, but at the same time, I think it's also a more important one.
Well, what are your thoughts about what we're seeing right now with the U.S. president? I mean, you've said that if he wanted these leaks to stop, for example, if he wanted to know if there had been any wiretapping at Trump Tower, he's the U.S. president. He can find out, right? He has that authority. We now know that there's no evidence, according to the FBI. The U.S. president, the White House, is subject of an investigation into possible collusion with the Russians. When you look at all of this, do you have any confidence then that this administration is going to be the administration that's going to reform the NSA or surveillance? I mean, yeah. I mean, I know it may make you laugh, but that's where we are.
What do you think? Right.
Yeah, well,
this is one of those things where, yeah, let's be real. Donald Trump has never represented himself as a friend of civil liberties. He's routinely called for more surveillance. He's called for the return of torture, right?
But he did praise the WikiLeaks in the campaign. Let's not forget that, Edward. He thought they were great. Now he thinks it's un-American.
They were fabulous, lovely, everything great. First off, I'm not WikiLeaks, separate organization. WikiLeaks is not surveillance. They are a publishing outlet. They're a Dropbox. They publish what they get, right? I'm not here to say they're good or bad. They're sort of a completely separate track.
But a lot of people, let me ask you this, since you mentioned that. Let me ask you this. A lot of people here in Germany, in Europe, but also in the U.S., in the media here, there are the allegations made, or it's insinuated that you are connected to WikiLeaks at some point, that there's a Russian connection here. Can you tell us tonight, is there any connection between you and WikiLeaks?
No. I mean, this is well-established public fact, right? WikiLeaks was in contact with my legal defense team, right? And they helped me leave Hong Kong as a prominent journalistic source, right? This is, again, this has been publicly reported exhaustively. This is ancient history. That's 2013, right? I don't talk to Julian Assange. I don't talk to WikiLeaks. I have no relationship with them. I think what they did in 2013 was a good thing. I think their recent publications, in many cases, have been a genuine public service, right? Regardless of whether you think, WikiLeaks are good guys or bad guys, regardless of whether you think this information came from the Russians or anyone else, there are two questions that a journalistic outlet has to evaluate. One, is the information authentic? Two, is it in the public interest to know? I think in any of these cases, that's pretty well established. These stories were reported on by every major newspaper, not just in Germany, in the United States, around the world. There's no doubt these things were valuable. Did it swing the election? Seems very doubtful, very dubious. Did it change some minds? Probably not. This was the most powerful, well, sorry, probably yes. This was the most partisan election that we've had in memory. Both candidates were historically unpopular. Each other person was despised by the other side, right? And these kind of things create a fragility in narrative. But when people point to what was the actual cause that swung the election, and again, I'm not a political pundit. I can't claim any expertise on this, which is why it's always kind of a surprise when I get these questions, is the FBI director, James Comey, right before the election, gave the basically Donald Trump's party the talking point, Hillary Clinton is under criminal investigation for her emails, which, by the way, are entirely separate from the emails that were actually published by WikiLeaks, to my knowledge. I could have.
That's right.
WikiLeaks published Podesta's emails. Hillary Clinton's emails were being investigated by the FBI, but it was a different controversy. And this was what they say, very likely swung the election. But the whole thing is, like, why are people so passionate about this? Why are people so invested in this? Why are people talking about, Russia and WikiLeaks and these connections and Donald Trump and everything like that? It's because we have lost faith in our institutions. It's because there is a crisis, a legitimacy crisis, facing not just the policies and procedures of our government today, but the outcomes of its processes. People look at Donald Trump as president, right or wrong, and they go, this is the best candidate. This is the person that the United States found to be, through its meritocratic process, the finest candidate to lead the country. And they go, and something doesn't feel right. And from there, everything else follows. There is a lot of smoke. There are a lot of things that need to be investigated. Yes, Russian influence in the election needs to be investigated. We need to find the facts. And if they did interfere, they should be held to account of the laws. But at the same time, we have to recognize that this is not news. This is not news. This is not new. Right? This is something that happens routinely. Every intelligence agency interferes in elections, commonly, routinely. The Washington Post did a story right in the election cycle that showed, we have interfered routinely throughout our history in countries elsewhere. Carnegie Mellon University did a study where they found the U.S. interfered in foreign elections, I think 81 times in the last 100 years. Again, this is not to say, it's hypocritical. The U.S. does it, so they shouldn't complain about anybody else doing it. It's that people focus on the realities, right? All countries are doing this. The Russians are interfering in our elections. The Chinese are interfering in our elections. The Germans are interfering in our elections in a very light, very polite way in their case. Hopefully, they're not hacking anybody's emails and leaking them. But we saw very strong statements coming out in an unprecedented way from German candidates that were criticizing statements of Donald Trump, saying he, was a very illiberal candidate that was harming human rights and blah, blah, about his statements on torture and whatnot. Personally, I think these things were proper and appropriate because I disagree with those policies, right? But foreign interference is a common thing. That doesn't mean we shouldn't take it seriously. That doesn't mean we shouldn't investigate it. But again, we need to look deeper. We need to look at the structural issues. We need to look at where the real soft points in our democracy are. If elections have been interfered with throughout history, why did it actually matter this time? Why did it make a difference? If it did, why did this one work when the other